Welcome to another Photography Simplified video, where I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Today, we're going to learn all about capturing or freezing motion using shutter speed. Let's get into it. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed works like blinds on a window. In front of your camera's sensor, there are shutters that will close or open to allow light to hit your camera's sensor. A shutter speed can be either slow, meaning that it opens and stays open for quite a while and then closes, or a shutter speed could be fast, meaning that it opens and then closes very quickly. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. A fast shutter speed is going to be something like 1/5000th of a second. A slow shutter speed, on the other hand, could be 2 whole seconds or a second. How fast your camera's shutter speed can go will depend on your individual camera's capabilities. Your camera's shutter speed can range from thousandths of a second all the way to very, very slow shutter speeds, like 30 seconds, for example. Most cameras will even have a bulb mode that will allow you to choose exactly how long you want the shutters to stay open for. When you press the shutter button, it will open, and as long as you hold it, it will stay open until you release the shutter button, and then it will close when you're using bulb mode. By the way, if you find this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing so that way you can see other videos that will help you to improve your basic photography skills. Shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle, which will be covered in later videos. But all you need to know is that aperture is basically how much light we allow to enter through the camera's lens. The shutter speed is going to be how long we capture light, and then the ISO is going to be your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. If we have a very long shutter speed, we're going to be capturing more light. A very quick shutter speed, we're going to be capturing less. So to recap, a longer shutter speed will be a brighter image if we're only looking at shutter speed, and a faster shutter speed will be a darker image. Let's look at an example using the camera of how changing only the shutter speed can affect the brightness of an image. I have my camera here set up pointed at this paperweight in manual mode so that I can control all of the camera's settings. Now you can see if I change just the shutter speed and nothing else, as I make my shutter speed slower, the image is going to be brighter because we're capturing more light. If I make the shutter speed faster, the image is going to be darker because we're capturing less light. Now, one thing that you'll need to keep in mind is that the shutter speed doesn't only affect the brightness of your image. It will also affect whether you are capturing motion or freezing motion. A fast shutter speed will be quick enough to freeze motion as it's happening. However, a slow shutter speed is going to capture the motion blur. In other words, as something moves through the image, that movement will be captured. Let's look at an example using a fan spinning at a constant speed. We're going to change the shutter speed to see whether we can freeze or blur the fan blades as they spin. To illustrate how changing the shutter speed can either freeze or capture motion, I have my camera here set up looking at this fan. We're going to turn it on. It's going to keep rotating at a constant speed, but we'll capture it using different shutter speeds to either freeze or blur the motion. For this example, it's important to note that we are going to be shooting in shutter priority mode, which is a camera mode that will let us choose the shutter speed, and the camera will decide the rest of the settings needed to get a proper exposure. We're going to start with a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second to hopefully freeze that fan. Okay, now we're going to lower it to 1/500th of a second. Now you can see that there's a little more motion blur being captured as we're using a slightly slower shutter speed. Now let's look at it at 1/100th of a second. Here you can see that it's totally blurred and we've captured the motion of the fan. One thing to keep in mind is that with faster shutter speeds, you won't capture your camera shaking and you can shoot handheld. However, with slower shutter speeds, you'll want to use a tripod to avoid capturing camera shake. How slow of a shutter speed that you can use without capturing any unwanted camera shake while shooting handheld is going to depend on the lens that you're using and its focal length. One helpful rule is to remember if you take 1 over the focal length of your lens and shoot at least that fast of a shutter speed, you should avoid capturing any of that unwanted motion blur. For example, if I'm shooting on a 50mm lens, I want to shoot at least 1/50th of a second or faster when handheld. Now, if you're like me and you find that still sometimes gets a little blur that you don't want, maybe your hands shake a little extra, you can double that. And that's what I'll often do. So in this example, again, if I'm shooting with a 50mm lens, I'd want to shoot at least 1/100th of a second or faster to avoid capturing any of that camera shake. If you're finding this helpful, there's much more content in my book, by the way, so consider checking out that.
If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
Slower shutter speeds can be used intentionally for artistic effect when taking photos like long exposures. A long exposure is basically just an image where you deliberately use a slow shutter speed to capture motion. You'll often see this with things like waterfalls or light trails from cars. Long exposures can be really fun. However, one beginner tip is you might get frustrated going out and using a slower shutter speed only to find that your images are severely overexposed and blown out. This is because your camera is just capturing too much light during that longer shutter speed. Often to do a cool long exposure of something like a waterfall, for instance, during brighter times of the day, you'll need to use what's called an ND filter. I'll have a later video on these, but they're basically like sunglasses for your camera lens. You'll put it on, it'll make everything darker, allowing you to use a longer shutter speed without overexposing your image. If you found this video helpful, please check out the other videos in this playlist. We'll see you in the next one.